The mud of Deadwood's main street was a thick, sucking slurry of horse manure, melted snow, and the collective misery of 1,000 miners who had gambled their souls on a vein of gold that didn't exist. The air reeked of unwashed wool, cheap whiskey, and despair. Clara O'Malley stood shivering in the center of it all, her hands tied in front of her with a rough hemp rope. She wore a dress of faded blue calico that had once been her mother's, the fabric strained tight across her chest and hips. She was 26, with skin like fresh cream and eyes the color of a stormy sea, but in Deadwood these things were invisible. All the town saw was her size. "Step up, go, move your heavy carcass." Barnaby Vane, the proprietor of the Golden Nugget Saloon and the man who held the deed to her dead father's debts, shoved her forward. He was a spindly, rat-faced man with eyes that watered constantly from gin and greed. He dragged Clara toward a large iron livestock scale that had been set up on the boardwalk for the occasion. "Gentlemen," Vane shouted, his voice cracking in the cold air, "gather round. Today we settle the debts of the late Patrick O'Malley, a drunkard and a fool, God rest his soul, but he left behind assets." A crowd of miners, trappers, and opportunists gathered, their breath pluming in the freezing air. They laughed, nudging each other with elbows sharp as pickaxes. "Assets," a toothless miner jeered. "Looks more like a burden, Vane." "Burden indeed." Vane cackled, slapping Clara on the shoulder. She flinched, biting her lip to keep from crying out. "She eats like a horse and takes up the space of 2 men. But she can cook, she can sew, and she's strong as an ox." He shoved her onto the scale. The heavy iron platform groaned under her weight. The needle on the large dial swung wildly before settling. Vane peered at it. He whistled low. "Look at that," he shouted, pointing a bony finger. 200 pounds of woman. That's a lot of feed, boys, a lot of fabric to cover." The crowd roared with laughter. It was a cruel, jagged sound that cut deeper than the wind. Clara closed her eyes. The shame burned hotter than fire, radiating from her chest to her face. She felt monstrous. She felt like a sideshow attraction. "I am nothing," she thought. "Just meat. Just wait. So here's the deal," Vane announced, rubbing his hands together. "I ain't selling her for a flat fee. No, sir. That wouldn't be fair to the buyer. I'm selling her by the pound. Like the cattle she is." He paused for effect. 1 penny a pound. Like the cattle she is. He paused for effect. 1 penny a pound. Who's got $2 for a winter wife, or a cook, or just something warm to keep the bed from floating away? $2? A man shouted from the back. "I wouldn't pay 2 cents. She'll eat me out of house and home in a week." "I'll give you $1, another yelled. "But you keep the dress. It's about to burst anyway." The laughter escalated. Vane grinned, enjoying the cruelty almost as much as the prospect of money. If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. "Come now, gents," Vane wheedled. "Look at those hips, birthing hips. Look at those hips, birthing hips. Look at that chest. You won't freeze with her around." He reached out and pinched Clara's arm. "Solid, healthy. Who starts the bidding?" The crowd shifted. The laughter died down, replaced by a murmur of low, ugly speculation. Then the ground shook. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the rhythmic, heavy thud of hooves on wood. A silence fell over the street, starting from the edge of town and rolling forward like a wave. The miners parted, pressing themselves against the muddy walls of the buildings. A horse walked into the clearing. It was a gray stallion, massive and scarred, with hooves the size of dinner plates. It snorted, steam billowing from its nostrils like dragon smoke. But it was the rider who sucked the air out of the street, Declan the Wolf Kincaid. He was a legend in the high country, a trapper who lived above the timberline, where the air was too thin for normal men. He was huge, wrapped in a coat of buffalo fur that made him look like a bear walking on 2 legs. His face was hidden in the shadow of a battered hat and a beard, as black as a coal seam. A scar ran from his temple to his jaw, white against his weather-beaten skin. He stopped the horse in front of the scale. He looked down at Vane with eyes the color of slate, cold, hard, and utterly devoid of fear. "What is this?" Declan rumbled. His voice was a low vibration that rattled the teeth of the men in the front row. Vane swallowed hard. His bravado flickered. Just business, Mr. Kincaid. Settling a debt. Selling off livestock." "Livestock," Declan repeated flatly. He looked at Clara. She was trembling on the scale, her eyes squeezed shut, tears leaking from under her lashes to freeze on her cheeks. He saw her hands, red with cold, clenching her dress. He saw the curve of her neck, vulnerable and white. He saw the softness that the world called a flaw, but which his eyes starved for beauty in a landscape of rock and ice drank in like water. "How much?" Declan asked. Vane blinked. "Excuse me." "The price," Declan growled. "You said by the pound." "Oh, yes." Vane recovered, greed overriding his terror. "A penny a pound. £200. That's $2, Mr. Kincaid. A steal." Declan didn't move. He sat on his horse, staring at Vane until the smaller man began to sweat despite the cold. $2, Declan murmured, "for a human soul." He reached into his saddlebag. His hand was massive, wrapped in a rough leather glove. He pulled out a pouch. It was heavy leather, stained dark with oil and age. He dropped it. "Tithe." The pouch hit the counterweight plate of the scale. It hit with the heavy, dead sound of solid metal. The scale tipped instantly. Clara was lifted up as the counterweight slammed down. Vane's eyes bulged. He stared at the pouch. The leather had split open on impact. Gold. Raw, jagged nuggets of river gold, the size of walnuts, spilled out onto the iron plate. That's 5 pounds of gold," Vane squeaked, his voice trembling. "That's thousands." "She is worth her weight," Declan said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "In gold." He looked at the crowd. "Does anyone want to outbid me?" Silence. Absolute, terrified silence. Declan dismounted. He walked to the scale. He looked at Clara. "Open your eyes," he commanded gently. Clara opened them. She looked up into the scarred face of the wolf. She expected to see disgust. She expected to see lust. Instead, she saw something that looked like hunger. But not for food. "Step down," Declan said. He offered her a hand. Clara took it. His grip was warm, calloused and strong enough to crush stone. He helped her off the scale. He didn't let go. He pulled her toward his horse. "Vane," Declan shouted, without looking back. "Keep the change. But if I ever hear you spoke her name again, I will come back for the interest." He lifted Clara 200 pounds of soft curves and heavy wool as if she were a feather. He settled her in the saddle in front of him. He swung up behind her, his massive chest a wall of heat against her back. He kicked the horse. The stallion surged forward, splashing mud onto Vane's boots, carrying them out of Deadwood and toward the jagged, snow-capped peaks that loomed like teeth against the grey sky. Clara clung to the saddle horn, terrified and bewildered. She had been sold by the pound, but bought by the ounce. And now she belonged to the wolf. The ascent into the high lonesome was a journey not measured in miles, but in the brutal stripping away of the world below. The mud of Deadwood gave way to slush, then to hard-packed ice, and finally to a pristine, blinding white powder that swallowed the hooves of the grey stallion in silence. Clara O'Malley clung to the saddle horn, her knuckles white against the dark leather. She was terrified, not just of the height, that the trail was a ribbon of treacherous shale clinging to a drop that turned the pine trees below into moss, but of the man behind her. Declan Cade was a furnace. His chest broad and solid as a canyon wall, pressed against her back, radiating a heat that mocked the freezing wind. One of his massive arms was wrapped around her waist to hold her steady. To anyone else, it might have felt like an embrace. To Clara, it felt like a shackle. He bought me, she thought, the shame spiraling in her gut like bad whiskey. He paid gold for me by the pound, like a prize hog. She tried to hold herself rigid, to keep her softness from pressing against him, terrified he would feel the roll of her waist or the width of her hips and regret his purchase. She was acutely aware of every bump in the trail that threw her weight against him. Every time the horse surged, she felt heavy, burdensome, a load of cargo that would surely tire the beast. "Sit back," Declan rumbled. His voice was a vibration against her spine, deep and resonant. "You're fighting the saddle. You'll bruise." I don't want to be heavy for the horse," Clara whispered, the wind snatching the words from her frozen lips. Declan didn't answer immediately. He adjusted his grip, pulling her tighter against him, effectively forcing her to lean back. "The horse pulls timber in the summer," he said flatly. "You are feathers to him." It was a lie, surely. But Clara leaned back. She had no choice. The altitude was making her head swim, the air thinning until every breath felt like sipping water through a straw. They rode for hours. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the snow in shades of violet and bruised blue. Just when Clara thought she would simply freeze into a statue of ice and misery, they crested a ridge. "Home," Declan grunted. Clara looked up. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress built by a man who hated the world. Wedged into a deep granite overhang that protected it from avalanches, the cabin was a low, sprawling structure of black logs. It looked less like a house and more like a bear's den reinforced with iron. There were no welcoming lights in the windows, no smoke curled from the chimney. It sat dark and silent, a brooding shadow against the white mountain. Declan dismounted. He hit the snow with a heavy thud. He didn't wait for Clara to try to scramble down. He reached up, his hands spanning her waist hands that could crush a man's skull, but held her with a strange, careful tension and lifted her down. Her boots hit the snow and her knees buckled. Declan caught her. For a second, she was pressed against his chest, the smell of him overwhelming: wood smoke, cured leather, pine resin, and the metallic tang of snow. He looked down at her, his face obscured by the brim of his hat and the thick beard. "Inside," he commanded, releasing her abruptly and turning to the horse. "Doors unlocked. Don't touch the iron on the wall." Clara stumbled to the porch, her legs numb. She pushed the heavy oak door open. The air inside was colder than the air outside. It was a damp, still cold that smelled of neglect. Clara stepped in. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw the reality of the wolf's den. It was a bachelor's squalor on a legendary scale. The main room was cavernous, dominated by a massive stone hearth that was currently dead. The floor was buried under layers of dried mud, pine needles, and discarded gear. Traps with jagged steel teeth hung from the rafters like iron bats. A table in the center was piled high with unwashed tin plates, a disassembled rifle, and scraps of dried meat that looked suspiciously like jerky made from something unholy. There were no curtains, no rugs, no softness anywhere. Just wood, iron, and stone. Declan stomped in behind her, carrying the saddlebags, the ones heavy with gold. He dumped them on the table with a careless crash. He moved to the hearth, kneeling to strike a lucifer match. He lit the kindling with a practiced, efficient motion. Fire flared, casting long, dancing shadows that made the mounted antlers on the walls look like grasping fingers. He stood up and turned to her. In the firelight, the scar on his face was a stark white line. He looked wild, dangerous, and utterly out of place in a domestic setting. "There's salt pork in the cellar," he said, gesturing to a trapdoor under a pile of furs. "Beans in the sack, water in the bucket." He pointed to a narrow door on the far side of the room. "That's the bed," he said. "Sleep there." Clara blinked, shivering. And you?" Declan looked at the bed, then at her. He looked at her curves, her softness, the way the firelight played on her hair. He tightened his jaw, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "I sleep in the barn," he growled, "with the stock." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Of course, she thought. He bought me to save his pride in front of the town, but he can't stand to be in the same room with me. I am too big, too much. "I understand," she whispered, lowering her eyes. "I won't be in your way, Mr. Kincaid." "Declan," he corrected sharply. He grabbed a buffalo robe from a pile on the floor. "And don't touch the traps, they bite." He walked out. The door slammed. The bar didn't fall. He hadn't locked her in, but the message was clear. She was an intruder in his sanctuary. Clara stood alone in the silence. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and stinging. She was safe from Barnaby Vane, yes, but she had been traded to a man who looked at her and chose the company of horses. She didn't sleep in the bed. It felt presumptuous. Instead, she curled up on the rug by the fire, wrapped in her thin coat, and cried herself into a fitful, exhausted sleep. She woke to a sound she hadn't heard in years. Silence. Absolute ringing silence. The sun was streaming through the grimy windows, revealing the true extent of the filth in the cabin. Dust motes danced in the light. The floor was sticky with old grease. The smell was a mixture of stale coffee and wet dog. Clara sat up. Her back ached from the hard floor. She was alone. She stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. She walked to the window. Outside, the world was a blinding white sheet. There was no sign of Declan, no sign of the horse, just tracks leading off into the timber. He was gone. She looked around the room. A lesser woman might have sat and waited. A woman who believed she was truly worthless might have frozen. But Clara O'Malley was not worthless. She was big, yes. She was soft, yes. But she was a master seamstress who could turn a sow's ear into a silk purse. She was a cook who could make a feast from a stone. She looked at the grease on the table. She looked at the chaotic pile of furs. A spark of anger ignited in her chest. He paid gold for me, she thought. Fine. Then he will get his money's worth. I am not livestock. I am a woman. She went to work. She found a bucket and a brush. She melted snow on the stove. She found a block of harsh lye soap. She got on her hands and knees. She scrubbed with the fury of a woman reclaiming her dignity. She scoured the floorboards until the grey wood turned honey gold. She washed the grime from the windows until the mountain peaks shone through like diamonds. She organized the larder, stacking the tins and hanging the herbs she found bundled in a corner. In the cellar she found a side of venison. It was poorly butchered, hanging by a sinew, dangerously close to spoiling. Clara hauled it up. It was heavy 80 pounds of dead weight, but she lifted it with a grunt of effort, her heavy carcass proving its utility. She trimmed the rot. She cubed the good meat. She found onions, wrinkled but sound. She found a jar of dried sage. She put a stew on the fire. Then she saw it. Thrown over a barrel in the corner was a coat, not the one he had worn yesterday, but an older one. A massive coat of wolfskin and heavy wool canvas. It was ruined. The sleeve was torn almost completely off, likely from a bear or a cougar swipe. The lining was hanging in ribbons. Clara walked over to it. She ran her hand over the fur. It was coarse, smelling of the man. He lives like an animal because he thinks he is one, she realized. She found his sewing kit, a tin box with a rusted needle and sinew thread. She sat by the fire. The stew bubbled, filling the cabin with a rich, savory scent that masked the smell of old grease. She threaded the needle. She didn't just mend the coat, she reconstructed it. She used a double-locking stitch, the kind used for saddles. She reinforced the shoulder. She patched the lining with a scrap of flannel she cut from her own petticoat. She worked for hours, her fingers flying, her mind quiet. For the first time in her life, her size didn't matter. Her hunger didn't matter, only her skill. The sun began to dip. The light turned gold, then grey. The door latch clicked. Clara froze. She stood up, smoothing her apron rag she had found. Declan walked in. He was covered in snow. He carried a brace of rabbits and looked exhausted. His shoulders slumped. He expected the dark. He expected the cold. He expected the silence. He stopped dead in the doorway. The cabin was warm. It was glowing. The floor was clean. The table was scrubbed. The smell of rosemary, sage, and venison hit him like a physical blow, salivating and rich. He looked at Clara. She was standing by the fire, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked terrified, waiting for him to yell at her for touching his things. Clara started, her voice trembling. I cleaned, and I found the meat. It was turning, so I saved what I could. Declan didn't speak. He dropped the rabbits on the bench. He walked slowly into the room, looking around as if he had walked into the wrong house. He looked at the coat. She had hung it on the back of his chair. He walked to it. He touched the sleeve. He traced the stitches, tiny, perfect, strong stitches that held the heavy fur together better than it had been new. He turned to look at her. His slate eyes were wide, unreadable. "You did this," he rasped. His voice was rougher than usual. "I am a seamstress, Mr. Kincaid," Clara said, lifting her chin slightly, "and a cook. You paid for weight. I thought I should carry it." Declan looked at the food. He looked at the clean window. He looked at the coat. Then he looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the sweat on her brow. He saw the red knees from scrubbing his floor. He saw the pride she was trying to hide behind her fear. He felt a tightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in 10 years. A cracking of the ice. "Declan," he said again. "What?" "My name," he growled, "is Declan." He walked to the table and sat down. He walked to the table and sat down. He didn't mock her. He didn't tell her she took up too much space. He picked up a spoon. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to the chair opposite him. "Eat. You worked hard." Clara hesitated. Then she sat. The chair creaked under her, but for the first time she didn't flinch at the sound. Declan took a bite of the stew. He closed his eyes. A sound escaped. Him, a low rumble of pleasure that had nothing to do with anger. "Good," he grunted. He opened his eyes and looked at her. The darkness in his gaze had softened, just a fraction. "You earned your keep today, Clara," he said quietly. "And then some." It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a poem. But to the woman who had been sold by the pound, it was the first time anyone had acknowledged that her value came from what she could do, not just what she weighed. And in the warmth of the cabin she had made, Clara O'Malley took her first bite of food without shame. The winter that descended on the High Lonesome 3 weeks later did not arrive with a whisper. It arrived with a roar that shook the very foundations of the granite peaks. The wind, which had been stripping the needles from the pines for days, abruptly shifted, turning into a white-out fury that erased the world. The temperature plummeted until the logs of the cabin groaned and popped like rifle shots as the sap froze deep within the wood. Declan had been restless all morning. He had paced the small floor, checking the bar on the door, checking the shutters. He moved with a heavy, dragging energy that Clara, sitting by the fire mending a tear in his spare shirt, tracked with her eyes. "But caches," Declan grunted, staring at the window where the frost was thickening into an opaque curtain. "The lower trap line. If the Wolverines get into the bait, we lose the season." Clara looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "It's a whiteout, Declan. You can't see your hand in front of your face. Stock doesn't care about the weather," he snapped, grabbing his heavy coat, the one she had mended and a coil of rope. "Keep the fire high. If I'm not back in an hour, don't come looking. You'll die in the drift." He opened the door. The wind shrieked, tearing the heat from the room instantly. He stepped out, and the white darkness swallowed him whole. Clara barred the door. She went back to her sewing, but her hands were shaking. She listened. An hour passed. Then 2. The silence of the cabin, usually a comfort since she had scrubbed it clean, became a threat. The wind howled like a banshee, batting at the heavy timbers. Clara stood up. She paced to the window, nothing but blackness and the swirling ghosts of snow. "He said, 'Don't come looking,'" she told herself. "He said I would die." But she remembered the look in his eyes when he talked about the silence. It wasn't hatred, it was protection. And without him, she was just a woman alone in a frozen tomb. She waited 10 more minutes. Then she heard it. A heavy thud against the door. Not a knock, a collision. "Declan." She rushed to the door. She threw the bar up. The wind slammed the door inward, nearly knocking her off her feet. Declan fell into the room. He didn't walk in. He collapsed. He was a mountain of snow and fur, crashing onto the floorboards with a wet, sickening sound. Clara screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. "Declan!" He was conscious, but barely. His face was grey, his lips blue. He was clutching his right thigh. "Slide!" he gasped, his teeth chattering so hard the words were barely intelligible. "Shale gave way, fell onto deadfall." Clara looked at his leg. The heavy canvas of his trousers was torn open. Beneath it, a jagged piece of pine branch, thick as a wrist, had impaled his thigh. It had snapped off, leaving 6 inches of wood buried in the muscle. The blood was dark and sluggish, freezing before it could drip. "We have to get you to the fire," Clara said, her voice trembling but fierce. "Can't," Declan wheezed. "Too heavy. Leave me here." "No," Clara said. "You are not too heavy. Not for me." She stood up. She wasn't a delicate flower. She was Clara O'Malley. She had hauled sacks of flour for her father. She had carried the weight of the world's scorn for 20 years. She planted her feet. She grabbed Declan under the arms. She pulled. She didn't just drag him. She lifted his upper body, using her own weight, her burden, as a counterweight. She hauled 250 pounds of dead weight across the floor toward the hearth. Her muscles burned, her breath sobbing in her throat. But she didn't stop until he was positioned on the bearskin rug in the glow of the fire. She kicked the door shut and through the bar. She turned back to him. He was shivering violently now, shock setting in. "I have to get this out," Clara said, staring at the wood in his leg. "Do it," Declan gritted out, squeezing his eyes shut, "before the fever takes the sense out of me." Clara ran to the stove. She grabbed the bottle of whiskey she used for cooking. She grabbed a clean rag. She grabbed his skinning knife. She knelt beside him. "This will hurt," she whispered. "Just pull," Declan groaned. Clara gripped the wood. Her hands, large and capable, didn't falter. She took a breath. She pulled. Declan roared. It was a sound torn from the bottom of his chest, a primal release of agony that rivaled the storm outside. Blood welled up, hot and metallic smelling. The wood came free with a sickening squelch. Clara didn't flinch. She poured the whiskey into the wound. Declan hissed, his back arching off the floor. She packed the rag into the hole, pressing down with all her strength to staunch the flow. "Hold it," she commanded. "Hold it tight." Declan's hand clamped over hers. His grit was bruising, desperate. For hours the battle raged. Not against the storm, but against the infection that bloomed with terrifying speed. By midnight the bleeding had stopped, but the fever had started. Declan burned. He thrashed on the rug, kicking off the furs Clara piled on him. He muttered in a language she didn't understand, Gaelic maybe, or just the language of pain. "Cold," he whimpered, his teeth clicking together. "So cold. The ice is in the marrow." Clara checked the fire. The woodpile was low. She had burned through most of the dry spits, keeping the room hot enough to stop him from going into shock. If she went out to the woodshed now, she would freeze before she got back. She looked at Declan. He was convulsing, his body temperature dropping despite the fever. He needed heat, living heat. Clara made a choice. She took off her heavy wool dress. She took off her petticoats. She stripped down to her chemise, a thin cotton garment that did nothing to hide the softness of her body. She lay down on the rug beside him. She pulled the heavy buffalo robe over both of them, creating a cocoon. She pressed her body against his. Her heavy carcass, her burden, her 200 pounds of feed. She wrapped her arms around his shivering frame. She pressed her soft, warm stomach against his rigid, freezing back. She tangled her legs with his uninjured one. She became a human furnace, transferring every ounce of her life into him. "Shh," she soothed, stroking his hair that was usually so stiff with cold, now damp with sweat. "I have you. The ice won't take you." Declan stiffened at the contact. In his delirium, he tried to pull away. "Too much," he mumbled. "Too heavy." "No," Clara whispered, holding him tighter. "Just enough. I am just enough, Declan." Slowly, the shivering began to subside. His breathing hitched, then deepened. The heat from her body, the substantial, undeniable reality of her form seeped into his bones. He turned in her arms. He opened his eyes. They were glassy, fever-bright, but focused. He looked at her. He saw her face, inches from his own. He felt the softness of her breast against his chest, the curve of her hip against his flank. He didn't pull away. He reached up. His hand, shaking and scarred, touched her cheek. Then it moved down to her shoulder, feeling the weight of her. "Clara," he rasped. "I'm here," she whispered. "Sleep, Declan." "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why didn't you leave me? You could have taken the gold. You could have run." "I don't run," Clara said simply, "and I don't leave things unfinished." Declan looked at her with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. The wolf was gone, replaced by a man who had been starving for something he didn't know how to name. "I didn't buy you to save you," he confessed, the words tumbling out in a feverish rush. "In Deadwood, I saw you on that scale." He moved his hand to her waist, his thumb pressing into the soft flesh she had always hated. "They saw weight," Declan whispered. "I saw warmth." He closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against hers. "The mountain is hard, Clara. It's rock and ice and teeth. Everything here is sharp. Everything here cuts." He inhaled sharply, breathing in the scent of her soap-and skin and life. "I looked at you, and you look like the only soft thing in the world." Clara froze. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging. She had spent her life trying to shrink, trying to hide the very thing he was now clinging to, as if it were a life raft. "I am fat," she whispered the words she had been beaten with. "No," Declan breathed against her neck. "You are sustenance." He squeezed her, pulling her impossibly closer, burying his face in the curve of her shoulder. "A starving man doesn't want a bone, Clara. He wants a feast. You are a feast. You are a feast. You are." The words hung in the darkness under the buffalo robe. Sustenance, not a burden, not a waste of space. Essential, life-giving. Clara let out a sobber sound of pure, fracturing relief. She buried her face in his beard. She held him, her heavy body finally finding its purpose, acting as the anchor that kept the wolf from drifting into the dark. "Then eat," she whispered fiercely into the darkness. "Take the warmth, Declan. Take it all." They lay there through the night, the storm raging outside, attempting to bury the cabin. But inside the cocoon of furs, the cold couldn't reach them. For the first time in his life, Declan Cade wasn't sleeping with one eye open. He was sleeping in the arms of the only woman strong enough to carry his weight and soft enough to heal his scars. Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below. The thaw did not arrive with a whisper. It arrived with the violent, cracking groan of the earth, waking up from a 6-month coma. The silence of the deep winter, which had cocooned Clara and Declan in a fragile, healing peace, was shattered by the roar of the creek. Swollen with black meltwater and sludge, it tore through the ravine below the cabin like a gouge in the mountain, carrying boulders the size of wagons in its frothing jaw. Inside the cabin, the air had changed. It was no longer the stale, recycled breath of two people trapped in a wooden lung. It was heavy with moisture, smelling of wet wool, damp earth, and the sharp chemical tang of lye soap boiling on the stove. Declan sat on the heavy oak bench near the door, his legs stretched out stiffly. The wound in his thigh had healed into an angry, knotted pucker of scar tissue that pulled tight every time the barometric pressure dropped, leaving him with a permanent, rolling limp. He was cleaning his rifle, a heavy Sharps buffalo gun that fired a cartridge the size of a man's thumb. Scrape, oil, click. The rhythm was soothing, but his eyes were not. They were fixed on the window, watching the steam rise from the melting snow in the yard. His instincts, sharpened by a lifetime of solitude and perimeter checks, was screaming. The jays had stopped scolding in the spruce trees. The gray stallion in the corral let out a high, terrified whinny that cut through the roar of the water. Clara was at the hearth. She was stirring a cauldron of rendering fat and lye, her face flushed with the heat. She wasn't the trembling woman who had ridden up the mountain. Her arms, bare to the elbow, were strong, the muscles moving rhythmically as she worked the heavy wooden paddle. She had filled the cabin with the scent of lavender and clean linen, waging a war against the squalor and winning. She stopped stirring. The paddle dripped thick, caustic liquid back into the pot. She turned to him. "Declan." "Quiet," he rasped, setting the cleaning rag down but keeping his hand on the stock of the sharps. He stood up, wincing as his thigh muscles protested the sudden movement. He blew out the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into the dim, grey twilight of the overcast morning. "Get away from the door," he commanded, his voice a low rumble that brooked no argument. "Get behind the chimney." Clara didn't ask questions. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped back, her eyes wide. "What is it?" "Mud," Declan said, peering through the crack in the heavy shutter. "Boots in the mud. Too many of them." Down in the yard, emerging from the tree line like wraiths of dirty smoke, were 6 riders. They were picking their way up the treacherous, slushy path, their horses blowing hard in the thin air. The mud sucked at the hooves, a wet, sloppy sound that amplified the tension. Leading them, riding a sway-backed mare that looked as mean as its master, was Barnaby Vane. He looked worse than Clara remembered. His coat was stained with months of tobacco juice and vomit. His face was a map of broken veins and desperation. He had spent the gold, the 5 pounds of nuggets Declan had thrown on the scale on whiskey, cards, and women who stole the rest. Now he was back, hungover and hollow, looking for the mine those nuggets came from. "He's back," Declan growled, the vibration of his voice rattling the window pane. "The rat came back for the cheese." Clara went pale, her hand flying to her throat. "Vane, but you paid him a fortune." "He doesn't want the payment," Declan said, chambering around. Clack thud. "He wants the sauce, and he thinks a cripple and a woman can't stop him." "Kincaid," Vane's voice echoed off the canyon walls, thin and reedy. "Declan Kincaid. I know you're in there, and I know you have the girl." Declan didn't answer. He motioned for Clara to get down. "Come out, Kincaid," Vane shouted, wiping mud from his cheek with a silk handkerchief. "We need to renegotiate." "I feel I was cheated. That gold was lighter than it looked. And the girl, well, she's a lot of woman. I think I sold her too cheap." He signaled to the men behind him, hired toughs from the railhead with dead eyes and holsters tied low on their thighs. "We want the rest of the cash, Wolf," Vane shrieked, his greed getting the better of his caution. "Give us the dust, and we'll leave you the cabin. Keep the fatso. She eats too much, anyway." Declan stiffened. The insult hit him harder than the injury to his leg. He looked at Clara. She was huddled behind the table, her eyes wide, terrified. But she wasn't crying. She was looking at the cauldron on the stove. "I have to go out," Declan said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "If they fire on the house, the logs will hold, but the windows won't. I have to draw their fire." "Declan, your leg," Clara whispered. "You can barely walk." "I don't need to run," Declan said. "I just need to kill." He opened the door. He stepped out onto the porch. He looked like death warmed over. His face was grey with pain, his movement stiff and hitched. But the sharps in his hands was steady as a rock. "Get off my land," Declan roared. The sound tore at his throat, but it came out with the force of a landslide. Vane laughed. "Look at him, boys. He's lame. The winter broke the wolf." "Take him," Vane screamed, "and check the floorboards for the gold." The world disintegrated. Declan didn't wait. He didn't warn. He fired. Boom! The heavy buffalo gun roared like a cannon. The recoil shoved Declan backward, jarring his wounded leg, but he grit his teeth. The bullet struck the chest of the rider nearest to Vane. It didn't just stop him, it punched him out of the saddle as if he'd been hit by a train. He hit the mud and didn't move. "Kill him!" Vane shrieked, his horse rearing in panic. "Kill the cripple!" 5 rifles opened up at once. Bullets hammered the logs like hail. Wood splinters flew across the porch, deadly as shrapnel. A slug punched through the doorframe inches from Declan's head, showering him with dust. Declan dropped to one knee, gritting his teeth against the agony in his thigh. He worked the lever of the sharps. Click-clack, bang. Another rider grabbed his shoulder, screaming, his arm hanging by a thread of sinew. But there were too many of them. Bullets were chewing up the porch decking. Declan was pinned. He couldn't move fast enough to find cover. "Flank him," a gunman yelled. "Get around the side! Break the door!" Two men dismounted and ran toward the side of the cabin, hugging the wall where Declan couldn't see them. One of them, a giant with a beard like wire, reached the porch steps. He didn't go for Declan. He went for the door. He kicked it. Crash. The heavy oak door, which Declan had left unbarred to exit, flew open. The gunman stormed in, a Bowie knife in one hand and a pistol in the other. "Where's the gold, piggy?" he sneered, scanning the room. He saw Clara. She was standing by the stove. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't cowering. She was holding the handle of the massive cast-iron skillet. Inside, the lye soap mixture was rolling at a violent boil, thick and popping with heat. The gunman laughed. "Look at that," he taunted, stepping closer. "The sow is cooking, making dinner for the men." He lunged toward her, reaching out with his free hand to grab her hair. "Tell me where the gold is, and I might let you live to cook it." Clara didn't scream. She didn't faint. She remembered every name they had called her. Cow, pig, heavy, burden. She planted her feet. She used the weight they mocked, the strength in her heavy arms, the solidity of her frame. "I am not a sow," she whispered. She swung. She didn't swing the skillet to hit him with the iron. She swung it to unleash the contents. Whoosh! A splash. A gallon of boiling lye, fat, and water arched through the air. It hit the gunman full in the face. The sound was sickening. A wet slap followed by the instant, horrifying hiss of chemical burn meeting flesh. The gunman didn't scream. He shrieked a sound that wasn't human. It was the sound of a soul being torn out. He dropped the knife. He dropped the gun. He clawed at his face, stumbling backward, blinding and agonizing. "My eyes, God, my eyes." He crashed into the table, overturning it. Clara didn't stop. She still held the skillet. It was heavy iron, weighing 10 pounds on its own. She stepped forward. "Get out of my kitchen," she roared. She brought the skillet down. Plea iron struck the back of the man's head as he flailed. It was a bell ringer. He dropped like a sack of wet grain, unconscious before he hit the floorboards. Outside, the shooting stopped. The screams of the burned man had pierced the noise of the battle. Declan, hearing the commotion inside, had turned, exposing his back to Vane. He limped to the doorway, his heart hammering against his ribs, expecting to find Clara dead. He looked inside. He saw the steam rising from the floor. He saw the man curled in a heap, his face a ruin of blisters. And he saw Clara. She stood over the body. She was heaving, her chest rising and falling. Her apron was splattered with lye. She gripped the handle of the skillet so tight her knuckles were white. She looked wild. She looked terrifying. She looked magnificent. She looked up and met Declan's gaze. "He tried to touch me," she said, her voice trembling but fierce. Declan stared at her. He had left a victim in the cabin. He had returned to find a Valkyrie. "Is Vane dead?" she asked, looking past him to the yard. "Not yet," Declan growled, turning back to the yard, his fear for her transforming into a cold, focused rage. "He ran. He's hiding in the rocks, but he's out of men." He looked at her one last time. "Stay here," he commanded softly. "You've done your part, Clara. You held the line." He turned back to the yard, racking the lever of the sharps. "Vane!" Declan bellowed. "You wanted to weigh her. You wanted to sell her by the pound." He stepped off the porch, limping toward the cowering saloon owner. "Come here. I'll show you exactly what she's worth." Gemini said. The mud of the yard was churned into a freezing, bloody slurry. Barnaby Vane lay on his back, scrambling crab-like away from the massive, limping figure of Declan Kincaid. Vane's pistol was gone, lost in the slush. His hired guns were either dead or fleeing down the switchbacks, leaving him alone with the wolf. "Kincaid!" Vane squealed, holding up his hands. "It was business, just business. I can refund you." "I can give you the deed to the saloon." Declan didn't stop. He walked until his shadow fell over Vane, blotting out the grey sun. He leaned down, his face a mask of granite and old scars. "You sold her," Declan whispered, the sound cutting through the wind like a skinning knife. "You put her on a scale. You laughed at her weight. She's a big woman." Vane stammered, tears tracking through the grime on his face. "It was a joke, a sales tactic." Declan reached down. He grabbed Vane by the lapels of his expensive, ruined coat. He hauled him up until Vane's boots dangled inches from the mud. "She is the only thing in this world that carries true weight," Declan growled. You are chaff. You are dust." He looked toward the tree line, where the snow was deep and the wolves, the real ones, were beginning to gather, drawn by the scent of blood. "Start walking, Barnaby." "Walking?" Vane gasped. "But my horse, it bolted." "It's 20 miles to town." "Then you better walk fast," Declan said, "before the sun goes down." He dropped him. Vane hit the mud with a wet splat. He looked at Declan, then at the dark, forbidding trees. He scrambled to his feet and ran, stumbling and weeping, down the trail. The mountain would judge him now, and the mountain was rarely merciful to rats. Declan watched him go until he disappeared around the bend. Then the adrenaline crashed. His leg buckled. He caught himself on the porch rail, biting back a groan as the old wound and the new strain screamed in unison. "Declan." Clara was there. She had stepped out onto the porch, the heavy Sharp's rifle in her hands now, though she held it awkwardly. She dropped the gun and rushed to him, wrapping her sturdy arm around his waist to support him. "Inside," she commanded, her voice shaking but firm. "Before you fall." They stumbled back into the cabin. The smell of lye and burnt flesh hung heavy in the air, a grim reminder of the violence. The unconscious gunman was still groaning on the floor. Declan ignored him. He looked at Clara. He looked at the lye burns on her apron. He looked at the fierce set of her jaw. He pulled away from her, leaning heavily on the table. "Pack your things," he rasped. Clara froze. "What?" "Pack!" Declan barked, turning his back to her. He dragged a heavy saddlebag onto the table. He began shoving furs into it, ermine, silver fox, the best of his cash. He went to the loose floorboard and pulled out another sack of gold dust. He stuffed it in. "The pass is clear enough," he said, his voice hard and brittle. "Take the grey stallion. He knows the way down. Go to the railhead in Cheyenne. Take the train to San Francisco." He turned to face her, shoving the heavy bag across the table. "This is enough to buy a dress shop, a house, a life where men don't kick in your door." Clara stared at the bag. Then she stared at him. "You're sending me away? Look at this place," Declan roared, gesturing to the shattered door and the blood on the floor. "This is a wolf's den, Clara. It's cold, it's violent, it's no place for—" He stopped, choking on the word. "For what?" Clara stepped forward. "For a fat woman, for a soft woman," Declan shouted back, his eyes wild with fear. "Not for himself, but for her. I bought you because I wanted warmth. But I didn't know. I didn't know the fire would burn the house down. I can't protect you from this life, Clara. I am the danger." He gripped the edge of the table. "Go find a man who wears silk. A man who sees your size and thinks mother, not target. Go be safe." Clara looked at the gold. It was a fortune. It was freedom. It was the answer to every prayer she had ever prayed in the cold, hungry nights of her childhood. She reached out. She took the bag. Declan watched her, his heart shattering in his chest. "It's right," he told himself. "She deserves to be cherished, not hunted." Clara walked to the door. She opened it. She walked to the edge of the porch, overlooking the ravine where the creek roared below. She upended the bag. Whoosh, clatter, splash. The gold dust shimmered like a golden cloud in the wind before vanishing into the white water. The furs fluttered down into the mud, ruined. She shook the bag out, ensuring it was empty. She dropped the leather sack into the snow. She turned back to Declan. He stood in the doorway, his mouth open, his face pale. You foolish woman, that was a kingdom." Clara walked back inside. She kicked the door shut. She walked up to the table, invading his space, forcing him to look up at her. "I was sold by the pound, Declan Kincaid," she whispered, her voice trembling with fury and love. "I stood on a scale and let men laugh at me. Do you think I will let you buy me off by the ounce?" She reached out and took his face in her hands. Her palms were rough from scrubbing his flaws, warm from his fire. "You called me sustenance," she said. "You said I was a feast. Well, you don't throw a feast away just because you spilled a little wine." She pressed her body against his, her soft, heavy, undeniable body against his scarred, rigid frame. "I am not soft, Declan. I just look it. I boiled a man's face today. I hauled you through a blizzard. I mended your coat when you were ready to throw it out." She leaned her forehead against his. "I am not a victim, and I am not a guest. I am your wife, and this." She stomped her foot on the floorboard. "This is my home." Declan stared at her. He saw the fire in her eyes. He saw the strength in her shoulders. He realized with a jolt that nearly brought him to his knees that she wasn't the fragile thing he needed to protect. She was the fortress that protected him. He broke. A sound that was half laugh, half sob, ripped out of his chest. He wrapped his massive arms around her, lifting her off the floor, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He inhaled the scent of lye and lavender and woman. "My Clara," he groaned. "My weight, my anchor." "Put me down, wolf," she whispered, stroking his hair. "You will hurt your leg." "Never," Declan vowed, holding her tighter. "I'll carry you. Until my back breaks, I'll carry you. Until my back breaks, I'll carry you." He kissed her then. It wasn't the tentative kiss of a man afraid to break something delicate. It was the hungry, desperate kiss of a man who had finally found the one thing in the world that fit him. He kissed her mouth, her jaw, the pulse in her neck. "You're worth more than the mountain," he whispered against her skin. "You are the gold. You are the mine." Clara closed her eyes, holding him tight. The cabin was a wreck. There was a groaning man on the floor who needed to be tied up and hauled to the sheriff. The door needed fixing. But for the first time in her life, Clara O'Malley didn't feel heavy. She felt grounded. Epilogue. 1 year later. The summer sun in the high lonesome was a brilliant, blinding gold, turning the alpine meadow behind the cabin into a riot of wildflowers, bluebells, Indian paintbrush, and fireweed. The cabin had changed. The dark, brooding lobs were now chinked with bright, clean play. A garden fenced high against the deer exploded with rows of hearty potatoes, carrots, and squash. A new room had been added to the side, built of golden pine. On the porch, a wide swing bench creaked rhythmically. Clara sat on the bench. She wore a dress of deep green wool, cut to hug every curve she possessed. She was sewing, her needle flashing in the sun. She looked up as a shadow fell over her. Declan stood there. He had just come from the trap line. He was still massive, still bearded, still the wolf to everyone in the valley below. But his eyes were clear, the slate grey warmed by a permanent inner fire. He held a basket of wild berries he had gathered. He set them down and sat beside her. The bench groaned under their combined weight, but it held. It was built strong. "Vane died," Declan said quietly, looking out at the peaks. "Sheriff found his bones in the lower pass. Wolves." Clara didn't stop sewing. "The mountain judges," she said simply. Declan nodded. He reached out and rested his large hand on her knee. He squeezed gently. "And it provides," he added. From inside the cabin, a sound drifted out. A cry, loud, lusty, and demanding. Clara smiled. She set her sewing down. "He's hungry," she said. "He's always hungry," Declan chuckled, standing up to help her rise, though she didn't need it. "He's a Kincaid. We have big appetites." He pulled her close for a moment, his hand resting on her hip, grounding himself in her solidity. "Go feed him," Declan whispered. "I'll finish the coat." Clara kissed his cheek. She walked into the cabin, the home she had scrubbed and defended and claimed. Declan watched her go. He looked at the garden. He looked at the strong, sturdy cabin. He looked at his own hands, which were no longer just fists, but tools that built cradles and held wives. He sat back on the bench listening to the wind in the pines. It used to sound like a threat. Now it just sounded like a song. A song about a wolf who was tamed, not by a whip, but by a woman who knew exactly what she was worth.